Hello and welcome to Date Ranges on the Bible with me, Aria. Now, what's my point of view? Well, I am Christian. I am an author of science fiction. This means I'll take a more relaxed and wide view of dates, but also need them to establish context as I continue reading. Because I'm planning to read through and see what my opinions are. Not opinions, but what insights can I add? Because sometimes things get so preachy and teachers spend so much time making sure their students know everything, they don't let the students actually read the material for themselves. And I've read a reading through where I just do my best to just say, well, this is what this says. But I have to date events because for dating is required to help establish why translations can be rough or word meanings are a little weird, don't match as content like. I have to make some assumptions like that if a Bible mentions another group of people, they have their own version of events. If someone else talks about in their mythology, I should at least attempt to find it. Because it's so far back, it's in there a myth. Possibly. Because gods in one story were probably originally people. An example would be Set was probably originally a person or a group of people, and not a deity, but has been elevated by the passage of time. That probably the oldest version of a word is probably the most accurate. Also, to assume that the names of finance people, especially booklers, cannot be found in archaeology. It's just not going to happen. This is from the belief that their name, their secret or hidden name, is power over them, and so will never or rarely shared and rarely written down outside of Scripture. So, archaeologists, you're probably going to spend the next thousands of years finding nothing because it wasn't written down on purpose. Ignoring the culture that you're trying to report on doesn't sound too smart when you think about it, when it's a taboo. While dating ranges or when events happen around before a date will vary. For example, looking for stories that have shared common story elements or geologic events that happen are specific to a period of time. Ice ages. Also, I can use supernovas if they're recorded somewhere else. Look for events like that. We'll start with here's an example of me starting with Jacob Israel moving to Egypt. The climate changed abruptly to Vet's life, less than a human lifetime, which means it would have taken less than 20 years for the climate to radically change. This would impact the Jordan River Valley, which is where he's living. It's a big area, but it's a good catch-all. Should be close to where he was living. Also would impact the flow of the Nile River, as Egypt was also hit hard, as his son Joseph. 7 good years, 7 bad years. That would have been about 8,000 years ago, an ice dam burst, changing the climate rapidly within one person's lifetime. You're wrong, but this best event with changing the climate Jacob's Valley lived, meaning around 6,000 BC. I thought about it after recording this once, and the audio was terrible, and there were a lot of typos. It could be because the word we translate as camel today, it's just long neck creature. That could be a cow. That could be a donkey. I thought back about how much they were carrying, and it was probably just a cow. Which also explained why it seemed to take forever. Also, it's during the Ice Age, which means it's a little wetter. Maybe, sort of. It's at least cooler. Well, that would put them leaving for Egypt around 6,000 BC. Exodus is not as hard, ironically enough, in some ways. It happened before 2435 BC because that's when the story, earliest writing, was said of in Cyrus. Earliest writing said of Cyrus, for example, they share a lot of key elements. Moses is in the household of Pharaoh, and he lives in the desert. You have a guy in the story of Set in Cyrus who lives in the desert and is the brother of the Pharaoh, and ends up leaving. Oh, Moses leaves. The Pharaoh dies without an heir. Yep, he dies without an heir in both stories. The Pharaoh's death involves a body of water. Yep, he's drowned by God in one, and he's thrown in a river in another. Or drowned in a river. Is it the Nile? It depends on which version I've read. Sometimes they don't know, sometimes they do know. No one really knows where the Red or Reed Sea is. Both stories, the household of Pharaohs is split, because Moses is part of it, and he leaves. And there's a crew Pharaoh, who's a jerk, in both of them. Which I didn't know about till more recently. But it's like, wait, this is 1, 2, 3. This is beginning to sound like two halves of a story. And the story of Moses talks extensively about how they're involved with the Egyptians. So when would the Egyptians write down a story that shares elements? This is why, to me, people become deified as time goes on. I see stories more like they share elements rather than, oh, it's going to be a perfect recreation of the other half. You're probably not going to get that. Partially becoming these states is because it helps me establish there's long time stands occurring between when they were written down, and this can lead to story drift. Drift in the telling as time goes on. The different cultures respond to traumatic events differently, just the way it is. Well, not the same story. They do provide different perspectives of what appears to be the same event. One of the people, her main being older than the two. Not quite sure what I was meaning by that, but one group of people have an older telling. Exodus is probably the older of the two because it's actually the most clear. It's most ordered. It's doesn't have a deized Pharaoh. It doesn't have a deified Moses. It doesn't have people deified. You just have God being God. It's a real tribute to the Jewish scribes and their ability to pass things down in family from generation to generation. Just a true tribute to their ability to pass things down. But how did people morph into? Where did I come up with this idea? Well, I recall, but don't quote me, that reading Norse mythology that Thor and Odin are people in their stories till they hit about Sweden, and then they become gods. I may be totally wrong. There's only so much mythology, and, well, I'm stuck dealing with the internet with AI era now. Time and drift causes people to become gods as their deeds have passed their held onto their cultural importance grows. Yeah. As people go on, oh, that was the guy who colonized it. His deeds get greater and greater and greater. And bigger and bigger and bigger as time goes on. And they become less and less human, and they become deified. They become super people. The Greeks have this. You look at a lot of Greek mythology, it's mostly, if you get rid of all the magic and the supernatural, it's just boring old palace politics. It's a good old soap opera. Yeah. And yes, I did look up the Hebrew word for silver. It's apparently also can just mean pay. So it could have been converted at one time. I don't know. Things do shift ever so slightly as time goes on. Anyway, thank you for joining me on my short presentation on dating events of the Bible.